stuck on the second slide.
Okay, ready?
Cool. Okay. First of all, thanks for having me. Hopefully the sound isn't going to be a problem. I've got the microphone, so we'll see. So this talk is taking flight with Tailwind CSS. Just to start with a fun fact, these slides themselves are built with Tailwind CSS, which is, I think, pretty cool. I've got a blog post coming out soon about how I'm doing that, if people want to check it out. So a few things about me. My name's Oliver, as you know. I'm a full stack developer. I'm a sysadmin. I work for a company called Invika. I'm a senior software engineer. We're based in London. We've got offices down in Brighton and Manchester as well. So I work remotely from home. I'm one of the organisers of PHP South Wales. So we do meetups a bit like this every month, or usually in Cardiff, but remotely at the moment, obviously, with everything going on. My website is oliverdavies.uk, where I do blogging about things like this, and you can follow me on Twitter and everywhere else pretty much as OP Davies. So GitHub and Drupal and Twitter and everywhere. So this is what my sort of tech stack usually looks like. I do a lot of work with Drupal. I've been doing Drupal for about 12 years, I think, at this point, recently. Started doing a lot of work recently with Symfony as well, so for personal projects and things, which is great because Drupal 8 adopted Symfony 2 a number of years ago, so it's great to have some overlap there, as well as working on various other things. I did a little bit of WordPress. I did this talk for a WordCamp last year, I can't remember, recently. The nice thing about this, all these things I've been able to do using Tailwind. So it's been a nice common denominator for all these different technologies. First of all, what is Tailwind? Tailwind is a utility-first CSS framework for rapidly building custom designs. So the key points of this, I think, are being utility-first. So it generates a lot of CSS classes. And rather than something like Bootstrap that gives you sort of full components like nav bars and things like that, Tailwind is based on more of a much finer level. So it's literally utilities, things like padding and text size and that type of thing that you use then to build up your designs from that. And the key point, again, being custom designs. So typically there's like a Bootstrap way of looking at sites. So I tend to look at sites and go, oh yeah, that's built with Bootstrap, but that's built with Bulma. It typically isn't that with Tailwind because the classes are so low level. There's no consistent look. So you could build some really different things with it, which is nice. It's a highly customizable framework. So everything you see pretty much with Tailwind you can configure. So even like the names of the classes and all of the colors that it generates and everything, what the prefixes are and that type of thing, it's all really customizable. So you can really tune it to what you need it to be. And as I said, it's very low level in terms of what it's actually generating. And yeah, Tailwind is more than a framework. It's an engine for creating design systems. I can't think where I've taken that from the website or whether I've said that. But yeah, it's nice because it gives you this set of consistent values, like for colors and margin and spacing and padding and text sizes. It gives you this out-of-the-box design system that you can use in your design. So in theory, you shouldn't have like a 97 pixel height on something because things should be a lot more consistent because you're using this already existing design system that Tailwind provides for you. I also saw this explained recently is it's an API for your design, which is quite a nice way of putting it. So these are some of the things that it generates for you. So text, border, background colors, font size, font family and font weight, text alignment, padding, margin, negative margin, flexbox utilities. There's CSS grid there now too. So positioning, list styling, Z index, opacities, screen reader visibility, placeholder colors. If you want to change the color of your placeholder, you could do that. First child, last child, nth child have been added quite recently. CSS grid, as I mentioned, transitions and transforms, spacing and divide. So these are things that, like, these last few things were added quite recently. So it is like constantly growing and adding new things, which is pretty cool too. So some examples. This is the homepage for the Laravel Nova product. This is built with Tailwind. This is the Firefox N website. This is also built with Tailwind. So you can see that there's not much similarity between these two websites. You know, there's no, I wouldn't look at that and say this is a Tailwind website versus that one. And this website is one that I built recently. So anybody familiar with using Drupal will recognize this as being Baltic, which is Drupal's default theme from Drupal 7 onwards. But this is a version that I made that's purely based on Tailwind CSS. So it's not using any actual Drupal markup, Drupal styling at all. It's all built on Tailwind, which took me about an hour or two to do, which was pretty cool. So yeah, so as I said, there's no consistent real look and feel, which is great. How do you use it? So slightly different to your traditional sort of workflow where you write your markup first and then write all your CSS in a totally different file. With Tailwind, you use the existing classes that it generates and you use those exactly in your HTML. So it's very much HTML driven, and the workflow is very much that you should not very often would you have to go and actually edit any CSS. Which is great because it really helps speed up your productivity because you're not switching constantly between different applications. You're not switching from HTML back to CSS, back to HTML, and then back again. And all this context switching just slows things down. Yeah, as I said, you can build custom designs without writing any CSS. So like that Bartik example, there was literally no custom CSS in that at all. You can obviously write custom CSS, and sometimes you are expected to do that. You can do things like extracting components, which I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but like you can do that. But you can build completely custom sites without writing any CSS at all. Or definitely even without less CSS as well, which we'll look at some examples of that later. So the benefits, yeah, you're not wasting time, as I say, with all the context switching from your HTML and back again. Another benefit, I guess, is all your markup, all your styling is nearer the code, so it's really easy to see exactly what's going on. You're not spending time inventing lots of class names. Like I've written classes like sidebar right inner wrapper marker something, just trying to think of a name for a thing. Whereas in fact, if it's a flex container, just call it a flex container. Yeah, you don't need to think of all these crazy names. CSS stops growing. So typically, if you're adding a new component or a new page to your website, you're going to have to write lots of CSS to go along with that. And more than likely, you're duplicating a lot of things, especially things like display block or padding 10 pixels or whatever. So rather than constantly having your CSS growing and growing every time you add a feature, once you've used padding 4 in one place, then you only ever going to use it once. So the amount of CSS, you're not shipping a lot more CSS to production every time. Because it's really easy to edit HTML, and I feel much more comfortable editing HTML to make changes than I am going into a global style sheet and changing something and not knowing what that affects. So I don't know whether that's just me, but that's definitely been a side effect of me working with this type of workflow. I'm much more comfortable being able just to go in, I want to make this particular button, have some more margin or something around it. I can go in and add it to that button that I need it to be on and not worry that I'm breaking every other button on the website. So yeah, to get a feel of this, these are some screenshots taken from an animation that are on the Tailwind website. I won't go through the whole thing, but this should give you some idea of how it actually works, how the workflow works. So there's some code on the grey background there, and then we can see the little sort of card at the bottom right-hand corner. And there's a couple of classes there already. So BG white is giving the white background to the card, and then rounded LG is giving the rounded corners, so the border radius on each of the cards. And also then the image has H16, W16. So we're adding a height and width onto each to that image. So the Tailwind workflow is to start adding classes. So again, we're not going to go to a different CSS file, start typing dot avatar wrapper, card wrapper, something. Yeah, we're just going to put P6 onto the wrapper. So P is for padding, and then Tailwind has a numeric scale. So 4 is sort of the base is one rem, and everything then is proportional from that. So if 4 is 1 rem, 8 is 2 rem, and then so 6 is 1.5. So it's really easy just to go, I want twice as much spacing, I'll double the number. We can make the image circular by adding a rounded full. That just adds a 100% border radius onto the image to make it circle. In the same way, we've got P for padding, we've got M for margin, and then MX is margin on the x-axis, so left to right, and we'll set that to be auto, so that's centering our image. We're making the H2 slightly larger by having text LG, so text large. We're going to change the color by setting text purple 500. So there are a number of colors the Tailwind gives us by default. And in the newer versions, at least, they're all, again, all numerical, sort of based on the mature UI system. So 100 being the lightest, down to 900 being the darkest. And each color has these ones. So this is a middle of the line, sort of medium purple. That's the word we're looking for, medium purple. And then we can use text gray 600 to make the other text gray. We can center the text using text center, so text align center. And yeah, that's the end of this. So if you watch the actual thing on Tailwind, it goes a little bit further than this as well. But hopefully that's enough to give us a bit of a intro into the workflow. And I think, like, at least for me, I find all of these things to be really almost quite intuitive. So just if I want the text to make, I simply wonder, like, is there a class for making the text center? And I sort of guess it might be text center, and it usually is. So I find them to be pretty obvious in a way what they are. So how do you install it? There's a CDN which you can use. It's on Unpackage and some other places that you can just add it into your HTML and just start using all the classes. But there are some downsides to doing that. And as the website says, to get the most out of it, you should really sort it via NPM. I do have some reasons why that's the case, but my speaker notes aren't showing up, so I'll need to think what those are. So typically with the CDN, you get everything, like all the classes that Tailwind generates. There are thousands and thousands of lines of them. I think it's up to maybe 1.5 meg or something, minified, but not compressed properly. But yeah, you get everything, and you can't customize it. You can't add extra plugins. You get, what's there at the box, and yeah, that's what's there. Whereas if you solve it through NPM, we can do other things like configuring it to be the way that we need. Things that we'll look at in a minute. So our second option is to install it through NPM. So we can use NPM install, or we can use yarn just to add the Tailwind CSS package into our project. So this will add it to our package.json file. Just take a quick drink, send. Okay. Now we've added it as a dependency, we need to actually add some Tailwind into our CSS. So this is how we do that. This is in a file. Typically, I will use Post CSS. Tailwind itself is a Post CSS plugin. So I will typically just write Post CSS files, which is why there's an app.pcss file extension for Post CSS. You can use it with Sass and less and other things as well. But if you use Post CSS, it only needs to compile once, and a lot of the functionality I would get from something like Sass, I can install through Post CSS plugins. So I started just using Post CSS for everything. And then these sort of Tailwind directives will look a little bit sort of odd. These are essentially placeholders that Post CSS, when you run Post CSS, it's going to find those markers and then drop in Tailwind's classes at the appropriate point. So it comes with sort of 3 sections, I guess. The first off is a base, so there's some reset and things in there. It's doing some normalize CSS and some other things in there to just give us a consistent thing to start from. Then we've got some components. So I think it's still just a container. There's they've been, again, really focusing on very small reusable utility classes rather than at any sort of component level. So I believe the container is still the only one that they have. And then all the utilities, which are really like the bread and butter of the whole thing. So, and the reason why this split out this way is that you can drop in extra things, which I think I have on my next slide. Yeah, there we go. So the order with CSS, as I'm sure most of us are aware, is quite important. So CSS itself mentions cascading. So the ordering in which we make our styles is very important. And in fact, it's one of the things that I see people on videos and streams and things actually doing, quote, incorrectly. Is putting these directives at the top of the file and then having everything else, their kind of stuff, right at the bottom. Whereas what you want to be doing is putting Tailwind base classes at the top, followed by your custom base styles, then your components, because your components will override the base styles. Then you want to put your custom components, and then the utilities, because you can then add utilities to components to override what's on the component. So for example, maybe I've got a button component in my project where I set a particular margin or padding or text size or something built into the component, but then I want to override one of those things with a utility. If I didn't order this correctly, the things wouldn't, you have to start doing, like we've all seen, I guess most of us have seen the exclamation mark important CSS thing. That's usually because the cascading is not working properly. Things are ordered incorrectly. So yeah, getting this order right is quite important. So once you've got a source file, like the one we just saw, we then need to build it. So Tailwind gives us a command. So we can, where we used npm to do an install, we can run npx to execute, I guess. I think of it as being execute. Then we can run Tailwind build. So this is a command that it ships with. We can give it the input file, which is the file that we just saw, and then an output file for it to compile to. So this is just going to run post CSS, replace those markers that we just saw, make the quote real HTML, and I put them into a file. And these are some examples, right? So these are just a couple of the text align utilities. So text left is text line left, center, right, justify, etc. So these are the types of classes we saw in the screenshots prior. So this is great. Now, if you just want to do maybe like a one-time sort of build, then it's fine. Typically, I tend to use a Webpack wrapper. So most recently, I've been using Encore, which is a Symfony project, but it works with anything. I've used Laravel Mix, and I've also used Gulp or Grunt or anything with your like pick your build tool. I like using Encore. So Encore itself is another npm dependency. Obviously, Symfony is mostly PHP, but this one is an npm dependency. So we can install it using npm install again, like we did with Tailwind itself earlier on. And then we need to configure it. So we have a webpack.config file in which we configure Encore itself. And this is the configuration file. So we can set an output path, so a directory in which we want to put our compiled things. A public path is just going to change the output, I think, within the compile file or within the tags. We then need to define an entry. So we typically on Core, you'll have a JavaScript file that includes a CSS file, but in this case, we've just got a CSS file. So we can use add a style entry. We call it an app. So the resulting file would be app.css. Then we give it the file to the source file to compile. That rhymes. So we'll take our p.css file, post.css file that we built a second ago. And because we've used enable post.css loader, it will run it through post.css. And then on-call, in fact, prompt us to add it to our package.json if you haven't already. Configuring post.css itself is just another config file, another JavaScript file, where we can just define an array of plugins. And the syntax does change slightly project to project. This is the way I like to do it. Just got an array of plugins with some require statements in. In earlier versions of CS, if Tailwind, you had to specify the path to the config file. You always had to have a config file, and you needed there was after the require, you'd have another set of params where you'd say this is the path to my config file. You don't need, you can do that still, but now it will find it by default if it's named something appropriate. So we don't need to do that. So it's nice and clean. Okay, let's take another drink a second. Okay. Now we've got that, we can tell Encore to do a build. So we can use npx again to run Encore. And then Encore has a couple of commands, one of which being dev. And then this is the output that you'll get. So it will run Webpack. It will hopefully tell you it's compiled successfully. It's written one file, and it's our app CSS file that we told it to generate in the config. And you'll see that it's big. Like I said, it generates a lot of classes for you by default. You don't want to be shipping the whole development version into production. So typically, you'll want to have all the classes and everything locally so you can use them. But then on production, you want to be purging them, which we'll talk about later on. And then this is our HTML. And you can see we've got a link tag about halfway down there for a style sheet. And we're just going to point that at the build file. So our app.css file in our build directory that we just used. So yeah, we don't reference the source file at all. That gets hidden, somewhere outside of our public directory, and we just build the compile file that we need. Okay, so Tailwind supports what it calls interaction states. So it's typically things like hover, focus, active, disabled. It adds other ones now like group hover and first child, last child, like I mentioned earlier on. And this is really where we start getting away from like inline styles. So typically you see like your style equals double quote marks. And like you could do most of the stuff you've seen like text left, you could just be writing inline styles for. You lose out on the design system side of it, obviously, but you can still do that. And this is where we move on from that, because obviously things like we can't do things like a hover state in an inline style. So the way we build this up is we define the state that we're going to target. Then we have a separator, and then we have a class. And this class is the same as any of the other classes like text left or BG red 500 or something. Any of these classes we can use a state and a separator for. So in this example, yeah, our state is hover. We have a separator, which is by default just a colon, which is fine because it gets escaped in the compiled CSS. And then we got our normal class name. And I quite like this. Like Bootstrap does something similar. Like you've got like for its column spacing, like col MD6 or something. So on like medium screens, it's column 6. What's the nice thing about that, like, the problem with that for me is the class name itself changes. So you then have to sort of think like, how does it change between responsive versions? Whereas the nice thing about this is the actual class for me stays the same, and it's just the prefix that changes. So it's really easy just to go, oh yeah, I want to add TextRed 500, and maybe I actually want to just make it hover or something without making too many changes there. This is how it looks like. So our TextRed 500 class is that color, and then on hover, we dot hover, and then escape that colon to make it valid CSS, which is fine. And then we apply the hover pseudo selector at the end, and likewise for focus. And then in our code, we can do something like this. So we've got a link with the class, which is TextRed 500. So by default, it's one shade of red. And then when we hover over it, it's going to be a darker shade of red. This is a little sort of snippet of the default config from Tailwind's internal config. And there's this key called variants. And each sort of Tailwind is split up into modules, so like of its own. So things like align content, align items, etc. So modules, and then it gives you some default states that these apply to. So most of them available. I think they're all available responsibly, or at least most of them are. And then certain ones like background color, you can see has hover and focus in it as well. So it means like those generate additional classes. We get the hover colon variation for those, but you wouldn't get them for background repeat, because it wouldn't make sense to change a background repeat on hover. It's responsive. So in the same way that we can specify a state, we can specify a screen. A screen is just Tailwind's way of making breakpoints. So again, in our config file, we have a key called screens. And then by default, we have 4 screens. I think these match the Bootstrap styles now. When the very versions of Tailwind, these were slightly different, but I think they're the same as Bootstrap ones now. So just make things a little bit easier. And the keys on the left are the names of the screens. So SM for small, MD for medium, LG for large, XL for extra large. And these are all minimum width breakpoints. And I should prefix this by saying I'm primarily a front-end dev, so I do quite a bit of primarily back-end dev. I do some front-end stuff, but it's not my forte. So yeah, these are generating minimum width breakpoints, so it encourages a mobile-first workflow. So if you're adding classes like TextRed 500, you typically be adding that for the mobile version primarily, and then you're adding on, stacking on these additional classes to make them responsive. Again, like something we can't do with inline styles. And yeah, if you want to have more screens or less screens, or those that, again, this is totally configurable. You can add, remove, change, do with what you will, but these are just the defaults that it gives you by default. So yeah, MD flex. So yeah, if we want to have an element and to make it display flex on medium screens, that's how we do it. And we can chain states together, which is pretty cool. So we can say, change the background of this thing to be red 500 if we're on medium screens and we hover over it. So yeah, we can chain these things together, which I think is pretty cool. I usually forget to mention that, but it is pretty cool, I think. So our responsive CSS looks like this. So we've got our mobile first version is just block for display block. And then each of those screens that we saw, it generates the actual media query for using the minimum width, the actual value. And again, we're just going to escape the separator, the colon there. And if you're working in a project where you can't use the colon for some reason, you can change that as well. And you want to change I was working on a project recently, and they've changed the uses Tailwind, but they've changed it to M rather than MD for reasons, I guess. So I keep typing MD and it doesn't work, but it's great that you can configure it the way you want it to be, So yeah, here's an example. So we've got a div, which is going to be display block by default, and some columns inside it, which are going to be width full by default. So they're going to be width 100%. So we can essentially have one column stacked above the other, on top of the other. And then on medium screens, which was 768, I think, we're going to display flex, which will display the columns next to each other horizontally, like columns. And then we're going to set a width of 1/2 to be each of them. And again, this is quite nice. You can say 1/2. It's really easy just to read and grok and figure out what's going on. As I said, it generates a lot of CSS. So there's steps there to control this file size to make this a bit more reasonable. There's a couple of them. So we can disable unused variants and core plugins that we don't want to use. So here's that variants list again, the default list anyway. And if we decide we don't want something, we can just change them. So if we're not using line self anywhere, we can just change it to be false. It won't generate any classes at all. And maybe we're not using hover and focus or background color, so we can take those out. And just then when Tailwind will compile, it just won't generate those classes. So we end up with a much smaller build. Again, we do the same type of thing with our screens and colors in this case. So again, if we're not going to use, like, screens are a big one actually, because if you think that we've got hundreds or thousands of classes, and it's going to have to repeat those for every breakpoint, If we're not using an Excel screen, then we can get rid of it, and that will cut down the CSS by a fifth or something, or a quarter. So we can do that. And let's say, again, we're not using gray 200, 400, 500, 800. We just remove them from our config file, and it doesn't generate them at all. This is great, I think, but it's obviously quite manual and hard to maintain over time, I think. There is a way of doing this automatically, and that's using a tool called Purge CSS. The Tailwind has been sort of an advocate and a recommender, for want of a better word, of for quite some time. And then now it's actually included within Tailwind 1.4 as a dependency, which is pretty cool. So within our Tailwind config file, there's now this purge key right at the top. And I realize we haven't talked about config files at all yet. But we've got this purge key, and we're just going to say, here are the files that hold our templates. So maybe our HTML or our Twig files or our Blade if we're doing Laravel or Vue or JSX. So here are the files, scan them as in effect. And then if you don't find this class, and if you don't find text blue 300, for example, any of these files, get rid of it because we don't need it. So this is a nice sort of automated way. Like it comes with some caveats. You have to write your CSS. You can't concatenate strings, for example, because it won't find things like that. It's a really, I wanted to say dumb, simple system, right, in terms of what it does. Like it literally just scans files and does string matching. Like, does it have this thing in it? And if you've concatenated them together, it won't find that. So you have to be mindful of that, I guess, when you write things in a certain way. But it is nice then for it will just do these things automatically for you, which is pretty cool. And then typically, yeah, if it's maybe like 1.5 meg or whatever it is now by default, like it can be like kilobytes, like 2 or 3 kilobytes after purging. Let me see. There we go. Okay, yeah. So just to do a development build, like our local build that we're going to be working with during the development phase, we're going to want to run Encore Dev because that will generate everything. And then for production, we're going to want to run Encore Prod or Encore Production, which just sets it into a production mode. It will minify the output and some other things. And then also right now you need to include this node env equals production. And this is what Tailwind and by proxy Purge CSS is using to determine if you're doing a production build. Laravel Mix, I think, does this by default. There's an open issue on Encore to do this by default, or we can just add something into your Webpack config file to do it for you, which is great as well, which I found like last night. So a couple of maintainability things. When people see this type of approach, like when they first see all these classes in there, like it's a really weird thing to begin with, and I went through it, and everybody who's worked with it has sort of gone through it. But it is something after you've used it for 10 minutes, you sort of get used to the workflow. And yeah, it's typically that like again, you'll see people say, "Oh, like I'm using the same 10 classes, to make a button. Like, do I have to copy and paste those classes everywhere, for every button?" And Tailwind does cater for that, so we can extract components out from it. But it is important to sort of just think, first of all, like, does something justify becoming a component? So something like a navbar, for example, you're only going to have one of them, and adding a class like navbar to it, is maybe great from a semantic, like HTML5 and actual nav elements are probably better for that type of thing. But coming back to that original point of, you don't need to think of names for everything, like just because they're there. So my approach typically is like use the utility classes until something justifies becoming extracted. And then if you've got some duplication, can we move the duplication somewhere else and essentially get rid of it? So here's an example. This is just a list of navigation items. So we've got a list of links. And this is a Twig template, and our nav items are stored as an array of items or object of items. And we're going to get rid of this duplication by just putting them inside a loop. So rather than having each one separately, we're going to have a loop, but now we've only got this list of classes, this combination of classes, excuse me, only exist in one place. So there's no duplication here anymore because it's inside the loop. If we want to change the text size or the color, then we could do that in one place, and it's fine. We don't, even though looking at the actual page source, at the rendered page source, you look at it, go, oh, look at all those duplicate classes. From our side of things, if you're writing the templates, we don't have this duplication there, which is the important thing. Another option is to exclude actual partials. So in this case, this is from a martial arts school site that I built. This is just listing out classes for kids and adults. So in this case, what I've got is a class list partial that has the classes in it, the actual repetition, what would be repetitive classes in it. And what we're doing is passing in the list of classes and the type, that we're passing through the dynamic stuff and then keeping the classes in a single source of truth. So again, there's no duplication because it's all in one class list partial. So again, no duplication. Tailwind does offer another directive called @apply. This is sort of a throwback to the less preprocessor, which sort of does this. And we can use @apply just to say use essentially the classes as mix-ins. So this is sort of not, a lot of people jump to this from right at the beginning, like something like a button. It makes sense. So what it's going to do is just take each of the utility classes, apply them to the element. So it's sort of like a SAS extend, or as in sort of, but then or a mix, a less sort of thing. And what it's going to do is generate the resulting class. So our A linked with a class of .btn, and it's going to put all those things. Essentially the same thing as if I put the same classes here in the markup, we'd end up with the same list of styles applied to them. And people tend to jump for this right at the beginning, but this only solves sort of one part of the problem. Like we're extracting out the styles. What we don't have is like the markup that goes with it. So things like buttons, it's fine. We can only have a button, but for something like some sort of card or something, we need the actual structure to go with that. We need the actual HTML to go with it as well. So in that case, it's much better to use like a twig partial or a blade include or a template part if you're doing WordPress. And then you've got the structure, you've got the classes as well. We don't need to extract the code in this way, and we've got rid of the duplication problem because everything's inside a partial that we can reuse. Take another drink quickly. Just keep an eye on the time as well. Customizing, we could run another npx tailwind command called init, which will generate a file. Generate a file called tailwind config.js. This is what it looks like. This is all we need to start configuring Tailwind. And it's just a JavaScript file with a couple of keys in it. The earlier versions are quite different. Like it literally gave you everything, and you were sort of responsible for maintaining the whole default set as well as your customized things and your additional things. So this new format is quite nice. This was added in like Tailwind 1.0. They made this sort of breaking change prior to the 1.0 release, and I like it because it's really clear, what stuff is yours and what stuff is the defaults. And you see, we've got okay. So if you want to add another color, we can just add it inside the theme key there. We can add a new color called inherit, and what that's going to do behind the scenes is create a new text-inherit, bg-inherit, border-inherit, like all the things that use colors. That additional color is going to be available there in the compile version. The issue, well, maybe not the issue, like in this case now, it's going to override all the colors because we've overridden the whole thing, which is fine because if you've got a set from a designer and you've got what's the word I'm looking for? Like a set of colors that you want to use, like a palette that you want to use, then it's great. You can just plug in what your colors are, and then you'll only get the classes that you need, right? Which is great. If you wanted to like add additional colors or just override a couple, you put them inside the extend key. So anything inside the extend key will get merged with the defaults. Anything outside the extend key overrides the defaults. So in this case, we're just adding additional color and not overriding the existing ones. There are some additional options like that aren't shown. The purge key we sort of saw earlier on. We can add a prefix. So if like I do this with Drupal 7 sites, there's like the blocks have a class of block, which would conflict with Tailwind's block. So you can add a prefix, like typically it's TW dash or U dash, utility dash, and then Tailwind's classes all get generated with that prefix, not to avoid that collision. So like I've done this before with Bootstrap plus Tailwind, and because it's prefix, things don't collide. And then also important is false. If we do want exclamation important on everything, we can make that true, and it will make everything important. Which for utility classes isn't that bad a thing actually. If we did need to see the whole file, then we can do init -- full, and that generates the whole file. But again, it's fine. But it's so your responsibility then to maintain it. And if something gets added in a newer version, I've been tweaking the colors and things again recently in Tailwind UI. Then again, you're not going to get those by default, so you need again to sort of maintain them. Tailwind, we can extend it itself with plugins. So if you need something that's there, that's not there by default, we can just write plugins that you can reuse. These again are npm packages. So this is one that I wrote. It's called Tailwind CSS List Reset. Prior to 1.0, there was a number of classes that are added to lists that aren't there post 1.0. So I decided just to re-add them through this little plugin. And I can add it by just adding it to that plugins array in the config file, and that will load it. And this is all it does. It adds list start done and padding 0 to that. And this is how it does it. So Tailwind export gives us a number of functions and things that we can extend. So like add utilities is a Tailwind function that we can call, and we can pass through sort of a CSS in JavaScript type format, and it will build the CSS for that. So this is great for like reusable things that you're going to want to repackage across multiple projects. And again, we get the variants there as well, so we can generate different variants for this if you wanted a responsive versus hover or something. Let's see, we've got time for a demo. So this is a site that I built. So as well as having like the rebuilding Bartik site that I did a little while ago, I was putting together, as last time I did this talk, I did it with Laravel Mix in it rather than Encore. So I thought I'd run through the steps again. And then late last night, I thought it would be a great idea to build a clone of the symphony.com homepage because, why not 1 o'clock in the morning? It's a PHP group. So I built this page. This is, in fact, it looks like symphony.com's homepage, I think. But this is, in fact, again, like a version that I built without any, like I've not copied their styles, or I've copied some of the colors and things and doing some of these images, but the actual site itself is built from that. So this is what we've done here. I think it's quite an interesting example. So if I just bring up, this is the version on the site. People can check this out later on. This is the same version of the site, just running locally. So like, if you have a look at the code here, it's just a indexed or HTML file. Like there's nothing particularly clever going on here. It is using there's a tool called Prettier, which I'm using, that's doing all this formatting. It's quite opinionated. I don't agree with everything it does, but it does what it does, I guess. Let's see, we've got only things we've got in here are Tailwind CSS in itself. I'm pulling in Encore and a post CSS nested plugin, so I want to use nesting. And then the post CSS loader. So that's all I'm including in the package file. The post CSS config is again just the two post CSS things, so Tailwind and then the nested plugin to give us some nesting. Let's see, what else have we got in here? This is my Webpack config, so pretty much what we saw on the slide. The difference being I've added in these two lines here. So because it's not setting the node environment by default, we're just going to use Encore as production to say, and if it's in production, make it production, otherwise default. So we don't need to specify that on the command line anymore. It's going to output it into a build directory here, which is this directory there. And yeah, that's pretty much everything. I have done some customizing of the config file. So set purge. Purge is literally just going to look at the web index or HTML file, which has all the markup in. Overriding some font families. So just to match Symfony.com's normal fonts, I'm just going to override the serif font stack that was there. I've added in Georgia. I'm going to extend some colors. So I'm going to override blue 500, override some grays to match what the normal ones are. The silver as well. And then screen's dark. So this is an interesting thing. If you want to support dark mode, you can essentially add dark mode as a screen through a media query. So I've got that working there. And I'm making some slight changes to border width just to say make it work on responsive and hover and focus. Quick look at this file. I need to install an extension, just add this. So one reason why I like using the PCSS syntax is that IDEs and text editors know that it's a post CSS file. So it knows to sort of highlight it slightly differently. Hopefully, there we go. I don't use VS Code very much. I've been using it a bit more recently. So you see our Tailwind base at the top with a custom base style. I'm just applying underline to hover and focus for links, then putting the components. Then I'm extracting a component for nav items. So because we've got multiple nav items. So we're just saying on the standard one, give it flex and gray and small, extra small. They're not large, so add screen also gives us access to responsive things. So we can just say on large screens, we're going to bump the font size from XL to small. And then on dark screens, or when dark mode is enabled, we're going to change the color. Then we're going to put Tailwind utilities in there, and then I've added a couple more of these myself as well. So this is the other way. If you just want to add sort of your own one-time classes without writing a plugin, you can do it this way as well, and just add them into your file. That's fine. So I've added some filter styles. I wrap these in the responsive at variance responsive, so it generates responsive versions. In fact, I'm pretty sure I can just do at responsive, I think. And yeah, it's just going to generate those. So this is, yeah, again, maybe a good, maybe I don't say good, an example of, you know, laying these things out in the right way, in the right order. And then the compile CSS goes into build, and we can just see everything. So yeah, it starts off with normalize at the beginning, and then if I move zoom out the way and let's scroll, and yeah, right down the bottom of the file we have the filter contrast 1 class that I just added in the source file. 80,000 lines of CSS, and yeah, this is prefixed with that dark screen. So all the screens come towards the bottom again because cascading is important. And yeah, you can take a look at this maybe yourselves if you really want to see what's going on. But again, this just dropping in these classes in the right place. So if I add in darker mode, it took about 10 minutes to do lunchtime today. So you can see I've got the sort of banner at the top of the page. If I just go back to the this is, this banner at the top that just says clone of the Symfony homepage. Then we're using some Flexbox stuff to lay out this header in the right way. So the header on the left, and there's a mobile nav. So if I just let's do this the quick way and just move this to the right. Let's just see there's the mobile version working. Yeah, so after that breakpoint, we get the mobile version, and if we just expand it, then we hit that breakpoint and we get the wider version. So yeah, we've got, let's see, where is that? Yeah, so we've got MD hidden. So yeah, hide this on medium screens. That's quite a common thing to sort of say block on mobile, MD hidden, or vice versa. We're applying that filter contrast only on dark screens, because yeah, that's how it changes the color. I've expanded out the nav item component is used for each of the links. So each of these links is a nav item, which we can see here. And you can see that on some of these, this we're adding additional classes to this nav item and potentially overriding some as well. And yeah, this all just goes through using some more dark mode things, using some CSS grid in here as well, which is pretty cool. Grid was like super requested from everybody. Space, I like the space helpers a lot. I used to plug them in through a plugin. They're now put into core. So if we have a look at, just see where that was being used. Space Y. So what the space helper is going to do is not affect the actual elements themselves, but they affect the children of. So we're saying add some space to the children on the Y-axis, so vertically of 16. And the first one doesn't have any, but the second one you'll see has like a margin top there. So there's no margin top class on this, but that's been added by the space. So that just makes things a lot easier to space things out and about. Each of these ones here. Yeah, so it's doing some calculating of widths and things there. So, what else is useful to show off? Or the demo even. I got my custom with arrow class in here that adds a little arrow to the end. This little sort of section is sort of a little bit special to itself. So I'm using some inline styles because these aren't design system values, so they shouldn't really live inside the design system. Again, just some focus styles for these, and as I said, this adding dark mode took about 10 minutes earlier on. So currently I'm doing the site, I'm in set dark mode. If I try and just open up my appearance here, type that right. Yep. And let's see if I change the thing to actually be light mode now, then the actual site itself changes to be the white mode. So because that media querying has changed, it's using the different set of styles now, which I think that's pretty cool. Everything else still looks the same. As I said, everything's responsive. So we've got our three columns, and then down here they shrink down to one column because of those things. So there's a couple of interesting, for something I just thought the last minute, let's build another little demo site. There's some actually quite interesting things in there, like the config stuff and the dark mode, and adding some extra classes in there. So that's pretty cool. That's all up on GitHub as well if people want to check that out afterwards. In fact, it's here. Yeah, rebuilding Symfony. So yeah, people can check that out afterwards as well. Let's see. Of course, it's inside the slides. There we go. Okay, so just to wrap up, there's some useful links. So Tailwind CSS, .com itself is a documentation site where all the documentation is. Again, it's all, I didn't mention, but it's all free and open source, which is awesome. Tailwind UI is a paid project, so they've where I said there's no components, there are a whole kit of paid components that Adam and Steve and now some other people are building with various JavaScript front ends as well, which is pretty cool. So yeah, that's paid, but worth the money if you use it quite a lot, I think. Built with Tailwind is like a portfolio site. I think a couple of mine I've submitted there. It's just a nice one if you're looking for some inspiration. Adam's YouTube is he does streams pretty regularly where he's either working on Tailwind itself or like building, rebuilding things like the Symphony one he's done, various ones. Some of the Laravel websites are all quite interesting. I maintain a Drupal starter kit theme on Drupal.org called Tailwind CSS. So it's basically what I was using to spin up new themes. I've sort of put that into a theme that other people can reuse. And then I've got some blog posts on my website for Tailwind, and then the bottom link just goes to my GitHub with all the repos that are tagged with Tailwind in them. So there's some interesting stuff in there. Sites, clones, plugins. If you want to take a look how plugins work as well, there's a few of those on there. Cool. Do you have any time for any questions? Anybody has any questions? I'm happy to answer questions. Otherwise, if not, feel free to ping me on Twitter or on various Slacks everywhere, or feel free to take a look through GitHub and maybe make some issues if you have any questions. I think on there as well. Otherwise, happy to do some questions now.